Greetings, everyone. As promised, here is your final bonus or extra lecture, if you will. Europe in the 21st century. We left off, the class is obviously Europe in the 20th century, but of course we didn't begin our lectures, our series of lectures, in the 20th century proper. We started with a couple of blitz lectures that took us sort of all the way through the modern period, because explaining the origins of World War I in many ways requires understanding the development of Europe in the long 19th century. You had all of those readings about that in the first couple of weeks. And of course, understanding that requires sort of at least a dim understanding or sort of a broad understanding in the general of how Europe got to the point that it did at the beginning of the French Revolution, sort of the map and the structures of the early modern European period. So here we are. I leave you off in 1999. And now we're entering into a period that is only just now becoming a relevant subject for history proper. As we said, there needs to be time for different schools of historical thought to develop, for different information to become available, for some time to pass. So for the first 10, 15, 20 years, it's really the things that have happened are more a topic for journalism or current events, if you will. But so some of the events that we're going to talk about now are entering into sort of the period where we can say now it's a proper subject for historical study. So last time when we left off, the European Union had been created, the Maastricht Treaty, and NATO had been expanding, the European Union had been expanding, the euro was being introduced. Of course, the euro doesn't actually enter into people's everyday lives, into their pocketbooks until 2002, 2003, but it had been created at that point, and the central banks were starting to use it for clearing purposes with each other. There were hints that the peace that had been achieved in the late 1980s and 1990s was in some ways illusory. We had the wars in the Balkans, the war in Kosovo, the hints that the relationship between new nominally Republican Russia and the West European bloc that was expanding under the auspices of the security umbrella, if you will, of the United States was going to be rough. And we're going to pick up that story. And so this is just kind of to tie up some loose ends for any of you who are interested. Several of you had said you were. So let's start with an overview of the political developments in the European Union since 2000, because it had seemed like, okay, we had some early efforts at European integration in the 1940s and then 1950s, and then those deepened and they expanded over the course of the 70s and 80s, and then the 90s the European Union is created and the institutions are expanding, and it's just kind of this triumphal wave, and it's going to be like the United States of Europe, just like Winston Churchill had said it would, all the way back in the 50s. Or actually, I think his speech, he did that in the 1940s, but the late 1940s. But so what happened? Because as you know, that's not what we have. We're now a quarter of a century in to the 21st century, and that's not what happened. So what happened? Okay, so political development in the European Union since 2000. So, let's do it. Constitutional reform. So the idea of drafting a constitution for Europe was gaining momentum in the early 2000s. If you want to think of the 90s or the years before that as like the Articles of Confederation period, to draw a parallel for U.S. history, which you're more familiar with, obviously. It was spurred, there was this desire or need, depending on how you view this, to adapt the Union's institutional framework to accommodate its enlargement and deepen its integration. The European Convention, which was chaired by Giscard d'Estaing, was established in 2002 to draft this proposed constitution. The draft constitution was aiming to codify the EU's values and principles that we have been talking about. That commitment to, liberal, democratic, social democratic principles, the mixed market economy, and the institutional arrangements into a single document. It was huge, of course, and it proposed a lot of reforms: establishment of a permanent EU president, strengthening the role of the European Parliament, enhancing decision-making processes, things like that. But actually, this constitution is defeated. It goes down to a vote among the member states. They put it to the states, just like the U.S. Constitution was put to the states, and just as unlike the American Constitution, which narrowly passes the vote of the states, this proposed Constitution is defeated, and in 2005, some of the early votes by it was the Dutch and the French voted down. And so they're going to explore, in the aftermath of that, alternative, more intergovernmental agreements. Angela Merkel, by this point, is coming to power in Germany, and she's a huge fan of intergovernmentalism. So this is all going to lead to the Lisbon Treaty. So the Lisbon Treaty, which enters into force in 2009. It's a much weaker treaty in terms of its supranational pretensions. The Lisbon Treaty was really just aimed at streamlining existing decision-making processes, enhancing the efficiency of EU institutions, and strengthening the role of the European Parliament. Some of the key provisions, included the creation of the External Action Service, the establishment of a permanent president of the European Council, the expansion of qualified majority voting in the Council of the European Union. While the Lisbon Treaty, though, does represent a significant step forward in the EU's institutional evolution, it didn't fully address the aspirations of those who had advocated a comprehensive constitutional framework. But it does provide a significant stepping stone. So let's dive from there into talking about, because that's really where it stops. And so now we're in 2009's first decade. As you probably know, those of you who have read ahead or who paid any attention to sort of history in high school, I'm aware that you were all born after 2000, so these weren't really events that were going on when you were really cognizant of their importance. But as you might know, there was a huge global financial crisis in 2007-2008 that originated in the United States, but which had huge impacts on Western Europe, the U.S. subprime market. Those financial products had been finding their way onto everyone's balance sheet. It hugely destabilizes Europe. Right at the same time, so this is a private sector, just like in the United States, this is a private sector debt crisis. This is these large European banks, which I know here in 2024, it's weird to think, but like the three largest banks by capitalization were all in Europe. They were France, Germany, and in England. And they had tons of U.S. subprime mortgage-backed security products on their balance sheets. And these had been being picked up by countries in Eastern Europe, and it was a huge mess. And this is going to kind of spill over then into the Eurozone debt crisis, because these banks are going to need the help of their governments, some of whom already have very large debts to begin with. So we'll just dive right into the Eurozone crisis. So the global financial crisis, 2008, triggers a severe economic downturn. Now, what happens in a downturn? Well, macroeconomic orthodoxy, which was inherited via the Keynesian paradigm, says, okay, we're in trouble, economic downturn, the private sector is laying people off, they're cutting spending, they're lowering production, people are buying less. Okay, the government then should start deficit spending. The government's revenue is going down then, right? Because the government is taking in less in taxes. The businesses made less money, so they pay less taxes. You made less money as a person, so you pay fewer taxes. People are buying fewer things, so there's fewer excise taxes coming in and sales taxes coming in and import taxes. All that stuff is going down. So government revenue is going down. And so along with all the other spending going on. So the idea was that governments should borrow money, deficit spend, to kind of goose the economy during downturns. And so this is what's going to be attempted here but there are several rules and constraints in place. One of them is a European Union rule, because the Germans had run a very tight fiscal ship, and the Germans and the French were really the ones who mattered in the creation of the European Union. This is not to be like some kind of big state chauvinist, but it's just a fact that it was France and Germany that drove this process and continue to drive it to this day. The Germans were very tight-fisted. They really demanded. Their experience, it was a product of their experience in some ways. The experience of the 1920s had been really horrifying. They had a very anti-inflationist inflation bias in terms of their central banking. The ECB was really the Bundesbank recreated on a larger scale initially, and so there were these sustainability and growth pact. Basically, there were these rules that you couldn't run deficits of more than 3% annually. Actually, France and Germany had both violated these right after in the early 2000s, and Brussels had done nothing about it. And so that was kind of a controversial thing, because then, of course, when these smaller states started to try and violate them, places like, say, Spain or Greece, Brussels did take a hard line with them. And so that really rankled, the politics of the European Union were rankled by this unequal treatment. But anyway, just so you know, that's what's going on here is you have these countries with these huge debt levels, public debt levels, but then you have banking sector fragility because you had a lot of private debt that had built up over this time. And then you have very, very slow or negative economic growth due to the global financial crisis. So, austerity measures. Yes, austerity measures. So, this was another thing. So this is part of what sort of rankled people. So you have the Eurozone crisis going on, and you have these rules that say, well, you can't run these huge deficits. And in order to get a bailout from these wealthier North European countries, countries like Greece and Spain and Italy, in order to get these bailouts, you have to take an austerity program, kind of like what the IMF would impose on these emerging markets in order to get a loan. And so again, like, these are supposed to be co-equal states within the union, and so it really, the policies were very, very tough. The crisis exposes some underlying flaws here. So, for example, the absence of mechanisms for fiscal integration and risk sharing among member states. This was something that the Germans had really strongly opposed. It had also highlighted the tensions between national sovereignty and supranational oversight. Basically, all of these individual states had their own banking regulations, their own oversight. There was no one authority there was no single standard, even though they were all part of the same monetary union. Efforts to address the crisis resulted in the establishment of some new institutions. That's generally what happens in a crisis, especially in Europe, is they create a new set of institutions, new set of rules. The European project of integration has kind of thrived on crisis historically. The European Stability Mechanism, the ESM, the Fiscal Compact. But I guess before continuing on, I should explain how the mechanics of the euro sort of exacerbated the Eurozone crisis, and why a similar crisis doesn't happen among like the American states, because it's not entirely obvious why the euro was making things worse, and why countries that had kept their own currency were better off. And it has to do with being what's called a currency sovereign. That means that you print your own currency, and you are free to competitively devalue the currency to boost your own exports. This is something that makes you a little unpopular with your neighbors, and it's something that the United States for years, that Washington for years, first they were mad at Japan about it back in the 70s and 80s, and from about the early to mid 2000s to again, it's back in the news now, China. Basically, if your currency trades at a lower level, your exports, people can buy more of your finished products, manufactured products cheaper. So it's a huge boost. So one of the I guess you could call it a flaw of the Eurozone, is the absence, and this is, again, if you are a big believer in European integration. So if you're a believer in European integration via the EU, you would say that a flaw in the Eurozone is the absence of a fully integrated fiscal union to complement its monetary union. Again, you have one monetary policy being run out of Brussels, but everyone is running their own fiscal policies. And yes, there are some guardrails, and there are more now than there were. But you can see how this will cause problems because let's say, the states just have different needs, right? Like Spain and Italy are more tourism reliant, their economies are, whereas Germany's economy is more of a manufacturing and exporting economy. Those governments, those states are going to have different monetary needs given the global macro environment. And they're going to run different fiscal policies in different macro environments. So the initial setup did not take this into account, and to some extent it still doesn't. So, yes. In a monetary union without a fiscal union, individual member states lack the flexibility to respond independently to economic shocks or imbalances. For example, during the global financial crisis, countries like Greece faced severe economic downturns, but were unable to devalue their currency to boost exports, to get more competitive globally, or to pursue expansionary fiscal policies to stimulate growth due to constraints of the Eurozone framework. And again, that's if you adopt the Keynesian idea that expansionary monetary policies by the government during economic downturns is a good thing. So, which I don't, but that's neither here nor there. This is just sort of the orthodox take. In contrast, the United States, while individual states do not have their own currencies, they benefit from a high degree of fiscal integration through mechanisms such as federal transfers, automatic stabilizers, and a unified system of taxation and public spending. And this allows the federal government to redistribute resources and provide financial assistance to states experiencing economic difficulties, mitigating the risk of asymmetric shocks and sovereign debt crises. Now, again, the United States wasn't always like this. Money and Banking in the United States since the colonial period. You can read it at the Mises Institute for free. There's a free PDF by Murray Rothbard that will explain to you the various eras of American banking and how that grew into a unified system like this, a unified monetary and fiscal union, more or less. But the adoption of the euro had led to a convergence of borrowing costs. This was another critical thing. So each country issues its own debt, and if you're going into the debt market, you would say, okay, obviously Germany is a better bet to pay me back than Greece. I'm just going to pick on Greece. Everybody picks on Greece. Their bonds actually just recently re-entered, I believe, investment grade, though, so good for them. Yes. So there would be a spread then. There would be a spread then between the bond yields of Greece and Germany. Well, when the union happened, the ECB said, well, for repo purchases, repurchase agreements, they said if there's one currency, there should be one rate no matter what. So what this did is it basically leveled the borrowing costs across the board. It in some ways dulled the difference. It very much actually dulled the difference in risk between borrowers. It just treated everyone within the Eurozone equally. So there's a convergence of borrowing costs across Eurozone countries as financial markets treated government bonds issued by different member states as equivalent in terms of credit risk. And this created an illusion of financial stability and incentivized governments to engage in excessive borrowing and spending, especially in peripheral countries like Greece, Ireland, and Spain. Critical point here. This doesn't mean that they went on some huge borrowing cost binge. What it did, though, there was a ton of debt, but a lot of it was built up from the 80s and the 90s. Greece had taken on a lot of debt to host the Olympics early in the decade there. I don't know if you guys don't remember that. I don't even think you were born yet in the early 2000s there. But as you're rolling over this debt, you're having to look at it and say, okay, well, what is the cost of rolling over this debt? Oh, well, it's not as high. There's not as much risk. We can borrow at this much money, keep it going. We have all these very lavish public spending programs. At the time of the Eurozone crisis, Europe was accounting for something like 50% of all social welfare spending in the world. It's something that Angela Merkel had given speeches saying, like, look, this is just not sustainable. We're such a small fraction of the world's population, and even economically, when we join together, and the Eurozone is a very large, powerful economic bloc in the world today, even today, despite several years of kind of stumbling growth following the crisis, it's just not sustainable. But this illusion of lower risk borrowing helps to prop up these programs, especially in places like Greece, which had built up a ton of debt as it had transitioned to democracy from dictatorship, and had created all of the typical social programs that are so common in Europe in social democracies. So this kind of dulling, this absence of usual market discipline, and the perception of implicit bailouts by stronger Eurozone members reinforced a culture of moral hazard, wherein governments were emboldened to pursue fiscal policies without significant market penalties. And again, even though the Germans had said, no, there's not going to be a common bailout fund, there's not going to be any, there's this famous meeting where Lawrence Summers, who was a big guy in the Clinton administration, and he was at Harvard for a while, a big monetary authority in the United States, had asked this group of European technocrats, so if there's banking trouble in Spain, what degree of authority or responsibility does the Spanish government have, and then the Spanish central bank have, and then the European Central Bank have? And there was kind of a pause where nobody said anything. And then there was just a whole bunch of arguing for 20 minutes, and it just kind of died off with no one really knowing. And it was kind of this sort of odd, foreboding sense of oh boy. Basically, it was not entirely clear, and yes, on paper that was going to happen, but push comes to shove, the market kind of assumed that the governments of the stronger countries would in fact step in to do something, and in fact they do. France very much puts the pressure on the Germans to do something. It takes a long time, and Greece is going to be basically dead by that time. They go through basically several years of Great Depression level numbers in terms of unemployment and GDP, declining year on year GDP. But yeah. Well, and in contrast, so in the United States, individual states have varying levels of debt and fiscal discipline. But their bond ratings and borrowing costs are different. And the federal government acts as a lender of last resort, which, again, that is a form of moral hazard, but it was less established and only guessed at, really, by market participants. Now I think it's pretty well established that the Europeans will do that. The ECB specifically, they have a fund for it. The Eurozone crisis exposed a lot of underlying structural imbalances and competitive divergences among member states. And this was something that was understood beforehand, but gosh, it's hard to describe the headiness leaving the 1990s and going into the early 2000s. It was just this idea that, well, yeah, there's all these differences, but economic growth is ticking along, and things are still developing, and basically it'll all work out. It'll all work out. And if a problem crops up, we're very smart people, and we'll figure it out. Which I know sounds weird now, because you've all lived in a period of permanent crisis. Basically, if you were born in the year 2000, your life has been defined by a rolling series of crisis. But that this was not yet the case. So the European Union is going to introduce some measures like fiscal consolidation programs and structural reforms to address these imbalances, but the process is going to be very painfully slow. The Eurozone crisis basically unfolds over 5 years. I mean, by the time the Eurozone crisis is wrapping up in 2014 is when I think the last of it shakes out. I mean, the United States by that point has been out of crisis for several years. The crisis in the United States, 2007, 2008, it's over by 2010. It's not clear, except in retrospect, that it was over at that point, and that economic growth and equity markets and things were going to start growing again. And of course, there were a lot of bond market distortions that the consequences of which have yet to shake out. But yeah, so that's the Eurozone crisis. That's really all I'll say about that. Is it was a combination of just a lot of debt, a lack of fiscal integration, bifurcated levels of authority, and I don't think that they would experience something like that again. In the same way, the United States won't experience something like the Great Financial Crisis again. There will be other negative effects due to the policies that they use to fight these sorts of downturns. Things like emergency credit facilities. This is just a political speak for the central bank will print you as much money as you need at a discount. You'll have to pay it back. There will be some kind of penalty, but basically you're not going to get a credit crunch the way that you did in the United States in 2007, 2008. You're not going to get these countries in the European Union who are mired in these horrible Great Depression-like circumstances for years on end. Those things aren't going to happen anymore. So, as this is going on, the Arab Spring has taken place. I can remember actually sitting in, I would run out to my car in between classes at Spring Arbor during lunch and things like that to listen on the radio because the Arab Spring was going on. Dictatorships were under duress. The United States was intervening in several of these cases. One of them was Libya, another one was Syria. Of course, Iraq was blowing up into horrible sectarian warfare at this point, and sub-Saharan Africa terrorism was spreading as part of the war on terror. Basically, all of this is going to create large waves of migrants who are going to start arriving en masse in Europe. And the European Union, the Schengen zone, the free movement of peoples, this is going to really hit Europe very hard. It's going to hit Europe very hard. The politics, politically, because there's always been those who defended these large levels of migrants coming in from Africa, from from the Middle East, because basically saying, look, here in Europe we have one of the fastest graying populations on Earth, but we want to keep all of this high levels of social spending going. We need more people in the workforce. And the natural birth rate in these countries is just not high. They just don't have a lot of kids. When you go to like Italy or something, you'll just be walking around for hours and see no kids. It's just this weird thing. Last year they only birthed like 300,000 kids in the whole country. It's weird. Anyway, they'll pay you to move there actually. Some of the, like in Calabria, some of the lower depopulated provinces. So if you're interested in moving there. But basically these migrants start turning up in vast numbers from these conflict zones. Europe is overwhelmed. They have no institutional framework for dealing with this. There had been high levels of immigration before, but these were largely coming from the former colonial possessions. There were institutions for dealing with this. It had always created some amount of sort of populist politics against immigration, just like it has in the United States. But this is really going to boost it and kickstart it, especially because, of course, you have the war on terror going on. You have actual terror attacks going on. The Bataclan theater attack, the Charlie Hebdo attacks. Like there's a lot of kind of xenophobic politics related to the war on terror mixed up in all of this. But these immigrants arriving at a time when Europe is feeling the fiscal crunch, because taking care of these people is expensive, right? And so it's all just putting pressure on the European Union, especially because Brussels is telling these states, you have to let them in, you have to do this, you have to do that, and it's creating resentment among sort of more populist conservative parties who are always very jealous of the sovereignty of their states, who are not keen to cede power to Brussels. So 2015 is going to be kind of a peak year for the migrant crisis, just a huge amount fleeing, again, from the areas that I talked about, the Middle East, North Africa, and the scale is going to really pose a challenge. So countries on the EU's borders, such as Italy and Greece, were really bearing the brunt of the influx, and it would create a resentment between the states, because the Italians and the Greeks were being told you have to let them in, but then they would do everything they could to shunt them up to like Germany or somewhere else, so that they would have to take care of them and they would have to pay the bill. Some of the Eastern European countries like Turkey were putting up fences trying to keep them out, which created conflict between Brussels and those countries. The EU was, then the EU started bribing Turkey to like keep them there. It was just bad, because just you had people drowning, these horrible crossings. I really don't have a lot to say about it, because really it's settled down some now, but in part it's because Syria has stabilized. Bashar al-Assad will remain in power there. The situation in Iraq is better than it was. ISIS, has been defeated, so there's less instability there now. The situation in sub-Saharan Africa, while bad, it's a longer trek, and the large population displacements that were taking place already happened. They already happened, and it really fostered a lot of populist politics opposed to Brussels and the European institutional frameworks, and Brussels really stumbled in handling these couple of crises, the Eurozone crisis and the migrant crisis. Again, they were very difficult challenges. You might say they could have handled them better, but they didn't, and so there you have it. Geopolitically, so this is all happening in the backdrop of an increasingly tumultuous geopolitical situation. Like I said, in the 1990s, these early efforts, these early processes of actual European Union creation, because of course European integration had been going on for 40 years at this point. Yeah, 40 years at that point. It's happening in a fairly benign geopolitical circumstance, right? Europe's security is being provided by the United States at a huge subsidy. There's no obvious threat to Europe. Globally, there is war going on, but it's things like Iraq War I, where the United States just goes in there and beats up the Iraqis. It's things like the Afghan Civil War. It's things like the civil war in the former Yugoslavia. Again, so which is these things are bad. Obviously, there's the genocide in Rwanda. These things are bad, but they're not the kinds of potentially earth-destroying apocalyptic nuclear exchange type things that Europe had been living with for so long. There were hints, and of course then the War on Terror happens. And we talked about the destabilizing effect this had on countries like Libya and Syria, and how this kind of blew back on Europe in terms of the migrant crisis. But more serious was sort of the mismanagement, or I guess suboptimal management of relations with the new Russian state that emerged out of the Soviet Union, because it was controversial. There were differing perspectives on how to handle the relationship with the new Russia. This goes all the way back to the unification of Germany. I don't have the. Do I have the book up here? Oh yeah, M.E. Sirot. She just wrote a really good book on this. The policies is all firsthand sources. And she's a very establishment historian, but she talks about the debates there. It's difficult to say, counterfactually, how different could things have been. It does, in retrospect, seem very difficult to imagine, liberal capitalist democracy consolidating in Russia for all the reasons that we talked about last time in the context of the 1990s. But geopolitically, the expansion of NATO, the Kosovo War, the defeat of the more Western, liberal, capitalist-oriented individuals within the Russian political and economic elite, who were never very many or very powerful. All of these things are going to combine to set Europe, unified Europe, on a collision course with Russia. Is Russia a European country? Catherine the Great had this treatise written where she opens by arguing that Russia is a European country for these following reasons. But if you have to start out your essay, your treatise about your country being European for these reasons, it kind of suggests that maybe there's some question of whether or not it's European. And just look at Russia, right? It sweeps all the way over Asia. There's always been this kind of tension. I think the work of Dostoevsky in the late 19th century is so great in the second half of the 19th century, because he is so self-consciously reflecting on these tensions in Russian life in terms of the sort of native Russian, Eurasian, Orthodox Russianness versus sort of the more Western liberalizers, in sort of the fashion of Peter the Great, who look to Europe for a model of how to be. And there's always been this kind of tension. And as I mentioned in the last lecture, Russia went from, the Tsarist autocracy of the 19th century and previously to, the Bolsheviks, to Lenin and the communists. And so they never had any tradition of the sorts of free institutions that make liberal capitalist democracies work. And so I talked about the policies to expand NATO and sort of the domestic political and considerations and things like that in the United States that had gone into that. But one opinion that comes up a lot is that the expansion of NATO was a way of safeguarding Central and Eastern Europe for eventual EU membership, because many of the things you needed to do in order to get NATO membership, things like the effective fighting of corruption, were prerequisites for EU membership. So, that's obviously not the only reason that NATO expansion happened, but it was one of the things that NATO expanders argued in favor of. And it's one of the reasons that, Boris Yeltsin had asked to join NATO, Vladimir Putin had asked to have Russia join NATO. But it was never going to happen for a lot of reasons. So again, NATO is Western Europe's defense organization, and just those norms are they don't fit. They just don't fit. Obviously, that's not to say that non-democratic countries didn't join NATO. Of course they did. Turkey, NATO member today, definitely does not have the most liberal press freedom laws, things of that nature. Some of the countries that joined it were still dictatorships when they joined. But certainly after the Cold War, there was a much greater emphasis on these sorts of norms, because this was what Europe was going to be. The definition of Europe has always been very political, as I said, because there is no clear demarcation point of where Europe ends. It's connected to the Asian landmass. It's one of the reasons that Ukraine became such a battleground. There's what's called the Big Bang. So there was two major NATO expansion projects. The first was under Clinton, the Visegrad Group expansion. This was Poland and Czech, and this was in the 1990s. It was very controversial at the time. Yeltsin objected. You had a lot of U.S. foreign policy thinkers who objected. You had lots of Europeans who objected, but it happened, and it wasn't the end of the world. Then we have the Big Bang expansion of NATO under George W. Bush in the early 2000s, which took NATO right up to Russia's doorstep, which wasn't terribly popular. Again, the Russians objected. Now it was Putin instead of Yeltsin. But the Baltic states, the United States had never recognized them as being part of the Soviet Union. Russia didn't raise too much of a concern about that. The problems really start in 2006, 2007, 2008, when the George W. Bush administration starts insisting that Georgia and Ukraine are going to become NATO members. Bill Burns, who he's been in the government forever, he writes this memo: "Niet means niet, no means no." saying that, look, we've gotten away with all this NATO expansion, but among all Russians, not just Putin, everyone I've talked to, he was working for Condi Rice at the time, I believe. But he's mentioned this in several places. He's director of the CIA now. But he said, look, expanding into Ukraine would be the reddest of all red lines. And as this is going on, this should have really been much more of a wake-up call than it was. The Russians invade Georgia, which is a little tiny country in between the Black and Caspian Seas there. And it's just, this is 2007, 2008, so right as all these crises are happening. And this had been why the Germans and the French, the German and French governments had pleaded with the Bush administration, let's not do this. Let's not do this. But, where does Europe end? It's a mess. I'll admit it. I mean, now we're right up to, the revolution in Ukraine, all the controversy that stemmed from that, the Russians keeping that naval base there, seizing the naval base in the Crimea, the attempt by the United States to get the Europeans to put sanctions on them. The Germans really didn't want to. They get a lot of natural gas and oil from them. So, and here we are today. Europe still very much reliant on intergovernmentalism, still kind of feeling its way forward. There have been obvious divergences within the bloc in terms of judicial norms. The Poles get smacked on the hand sometimes, their Law and Justice Party. Obviously, Viktor Orban is sort of a bête noire of sort of European Union fans. He's the leader of Hungary. But I mean, it's held together through all these crises. It has deepened, it has strengthened. The British left, the UK left, and it's still early to pass a judgment on Brexit. Obviously, if you're sort of a nationalist, you're pleased that they did it. To just looking at it, for me, I don't see that it helped the UK at all. Within the European Union, the European Union is basically a vehicle for the projection of power of the French and the Germans, and the British had a seat at that table, and they chose not to keep that seat at the table because they wanted more freedom of action. But as soon as they left, it was very clear that there was no additional plan. I feel like David Cameron had promised he would hold that vote, and then he had to hold the vote, and then they lost the vote, even though he didn't want them to lose the vote. Because immediately after that, they're floundering, looking for a rock to cling to, really, in the same way that the conservatives had latched onto the rock of European integration in the late 60s, early 70s, as sort of a place to be as the empire vanished and the British had nowhere to go. Boris Johnson's government, they immediately turn to the United States and they say, well, maybe we'll join NAFTA. And Washington was like, you're pretty low on our priority list, because what is Great Britain, right? Well, what is the UK? It's just a small little island, right? There's really not much there. They're a very small economy. Honestly, if you're looking to have a better standard of living, more economic opportunity and stuff, you're better off inside the block. That seems to be self-evident to me, just looking at the numbers. There are other things than a standard of living, obviously, but it remains to be realized. The fruits of Brexit remain to be realized. So that's where Europe is. Europe has expanded all the way up to the borders of Russia, the European Union, NATO, the Eurozone. Still expanding. As I mentioned, you can be in the EU without being in the Eurozone. It'll be interesting to see. I mean, the European Union is still young. The process of European integration now is obviously, almost 80 years old. The European Union itself, going on 30-something years old. it will be interesting to see how it develops, and certainly how the relationship with Russia is handled, especially if the United States, continues to pile up debt and other security commitments. Already, as any of you who watch the news know, the big focus for the last several years, there's been an increasing desire to turn and to focus not on Europe, not on the Middle East, but really on the Indo-Pacific region as sort of the future place that's important to the United States geopolitically. And so it will definitely be interesting to see how Europe will cope with that. I would be much more optimistic about Europe's future had relations with Russia been handled differently, because ideally, Russia is just a giant gas station, ideally, for Europe. Russia had, a very declining population, not very much skilled manufacturing going on. They did, of course, have some very good hard science, but really, if you go back 15, 20 years, it looked like a clear-cut win. Just, yes, Russia is going to be kind of this failed liberal democratic project, but they're graying rapidly. Their birth rate is really low. They're not going to compete with European goods, manufactured goods. They could be kind of a captive market, and Europe could just kind of run off of those raw materials, those commodities that they need, in which they are so sorely deficient in. Instead, now, the cost of manufacturing and stuff has gone up a lot, because they're having to source natural gas and oil and other materials from elsewhere, having to craft new supply chains there. So it'll be interesting to see. It's been a real joy being able to meet with you all multiple times every week, and I wish you all the best, and definitely stay tuned to see what Europe brings to the table as the century continues. Thank you all so much. All the best. Bye.